Hey guys, we're excited to partner with upcoming YouTuber James Lee of 5149. He's going to explain culture, politics, anything else that needs explaining, and we're really excited about it.
Yep, here is his latest effort. Let's get to it.
Hey there, my name is James Lee. Welcome to another segment of 5149 on Breaking Points. Now, I am sure that many of you at this point who are well in tune with politics are aware of the recent controversial revelations surrounding the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, the umbrella fundraising organization for the BLM movement.
Black Lives Matter under more scrutiny over how it's spending donors' money. As a new report claims, Black Lives Matter leaders used $6 million in donations to buy a massive, beautiful California mansion.
Yes, Steve, living like the rich and famous. You know, Steve, I'll be very honest with you. $90 million. They basically use black Americans for profit. Steve, ever since the George Floyd death, Black Lives Matter has profited from the George Floyd death. What have they done for the black community? Where are the community centers? Where is the improvement in education? They use this money for personal gain.
I think for many conservatives, this news served to vindicate their belief that BLM has always been a deeply flawed, corrupt movement. But the truth, I think, is much more complicated than that, as documented by journalist Sean Campbell in his expose about the BLM Global Network Foundation's shady financial dealings in New York Magazine. BLM has become a sort of catch-all term for the current civil rights movement, and the BLM Global Network Foundation has been the most visible organization in the broader BLM movement, with the organization shown to be marketing, branding, and fundraising experts. But their actual on-the-ground contributions have been, I think, much more limited, and we don't really know for sure how they are spending their money. Now, I think the rise and fall of this organization, the BLM Global Network Foundation, is noteworthy not just because of its attachment to the largest protest movement in American history, but also because it reveals a broader set of issues plaguing the nonprofit sector and its relationship with activism, with social and economic progress. And that's what I want to dive into today, which is the dark side of charities and nonprofits, with the goal that we'll all come away with a better understanding of how nonprofits can be used for questionable aims and what scrutiny you should apply to them when you read about nonprofits in the news or consider donating to one of these groups.
Well, Dana, every year you file a tax return, right? Well, for a nonprofit like BLM, that's IRS Form 990. It's basic, it's a bare minimum that states require when you raise public money. So listen to what founder and BLM's longtime executive director said Friday about the 990 and this controversy about how the charity has spent its money.
I actually did not know what 990s were before all of this happened. The accountant handled that. I don't know what that is. It is such a trip now to hear the word, the term 990s. I'm like, ugh, it's like triggering.
Yeah, not a great look. This being triggered by a disclosure form that all nonprofits must fill out. I mean, she was, after all, the head of a multi-million-dollar foundation. But in my view, rather than it being an indictment on the BLM movement itself, as I think the right-wing media like to portray it, and it's, I think, certainly not an accident that outlets like Fox News chooses to cover a story like this from mostly a culture war perspective intended to sow further division in this country. We also shouldn't ignore the broader issue, which is the perpetuation of a legal and regulatory environment in which an organization like the BLM Global Network Foundation could thrive despite repeated instances of financial impropriety, and the refusal of most of the mainstream media to apply a level of scrutiny that an organization of this size should most certainly warrant. The fact is, nonprofits are some of the nation's largest, most powerful organizations: hospitals, foundations, universities, and churches. In the US, there are over 1.5 million nonprofit organizations, generating over $2.6 trillion in annual revenue. And although most like to cloak themselves under this aura of charity or altruism, they, like any other organization or institution, are susceptible to corruption, waste, and abuse. But unfortunately, generally speaking, there is a lack of scrutiny in the nonprofit sector, all the way from the approval process to the regulatory and enforcement environment. Stanford professor Robert Reich, in his paper Anything Goes, Approval of Nonprofit Status by the IRS, dissected the ethics of present-day philanthropy and charity and found the IRS approval process for 501c3 public charities, which is the official legal classification of what we typically refer to as nonprofits, extremely easy. Referencing the chart you see on your screen, Reich found that the IRS approves more than 50,000 applications for 501c3 status every year and rejects only a very, very small number of applicants. Quote, obtaining recognition by the IRS as a public charity is an embarrassingly easy thing to do. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that when it comes to oversight of the application process to become a public charity, nearly anything goes. So getting approved as a nonprofit in the US is effectively a rubber stamp. And once a charity is set up through the IRS, it is ultimately up to each state's attorney general's office to prosecute misconduct. And like pretty much every other government agency in the United States, attorney general's offices are oftentimes resource constrained and have limited oversight and enforcement capabilities, with only the most obvious and egregious cases ever being brought to court. For example, it took the California State Attorney General's office over 2 years of BLM Global Network Foundation not filing financial disclosures, the absolute bare minimum for a nonprofit, for them to serve a delinquency notice. There's also just very little media effort dedicated to watching the nonprofit sector, and if they are, it's done to serve partisan interests. Just one example, but the Washington Post's David Fahrenthold, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the Trump Foundation, basically had a beat devoted to investigating Trump's financial mismanagement and potential misdeeds from the time of his first presidential campaign through the remainder of his presidency. The problem I see, though, with sort of this activist mindset masquerading around as journalism is that there will undoubtedly be asymmetric focus on certain organizations based on certain politically driven motivations. And so otherwise good reporting on high-profile nonprofits are oftentimes just shrouded in political theater. Headlines like, BLM's Patrisse Cullors slams racist report on organization buying $6 million SoCal mansion. Right-wing organizations will have no issues amplifying the misdeeds of BLM while glossing over the Trump organization's fraudulent practices, while the more liberal news outlets will do the exact opposite. And I think this problem will only, get worse as news outlets become increasingly more aligned with certain ideologies or rely on the donations and ownership of the billionaire class. This I'll get into more later. But in the cases of BLM and Trump, there was a certain political will to put resources behind exposing them. But I wonder, and maybe we should all kind of wonder, what about the cases of nonprofit misconduct where there isn't political will, or it would be wholly inconvenient to a certain powerful organization or individual to investigate? How much misconduct actually exists in the nonprofit sector? The truth is, we don't really know. Based on a research paper documenting fraud and corruption in U.S. nonprofit entities, quote, empirical research on fraud in the for-profit sector is well developed, aided by the availability of centrally compiled U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission data. In comparison, research on nonprofit fraud has been limited by a lack of readily available, centrally compiled data, leading researchers to rely on survey data or to undertake exploratory studies that identified fraud cases during a specific period. The reality is that while nonprofits often receive less scrutiny from the government, the media, and the general public, the sector as a whole is actually filled with many potential avenues for misconduct and ripe with perverse incentives that encourage unsavory behaviors. This, to me, is a huge blind spot in most discussions about nonprofits. There's this idea of the nonprofit industrial complex, popularized by a book called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. This idea that because the nonprofit industry is so lucrative, like we discussed before, over $2.6 trillion in annual revenue, there will undoubtedly be, as one scholar defined it, quote, a set of symbiotic relationships that link political and financial technologies of state and owning class control with surveillance over public political ideology, including and especially emergent progressive and leftist social movements. To put it in simpler terms, the nonprofit sector can and will be used by wealthy, powerful interests to surveil and even co-opt nascent social movements that threaten their wealth and power. So the nonprofit industrial complex does not exist to create fundamental change, but rather exists to protect its own status and that of its patrons, which makes it possible for the ruling class to not only contain a revolution, but to shut it down altogether. For example, in the case of Black Lives Matter, despite huge amounts of grassroots support and engagement, nearly every corporation in America was able to co-opt the BLM slogan without most of them enacting any kind of fundamental changes to their business practices, even in cases where said corporations employed an exploited, disproportionately black and brown workforce. I'm looking at you, Amazon. When BLM first published their website back in 2015, the co-founders described themselves as, quote, trained Marxists. But by 2021, they were doing Zoom events sponsored by global capitalist boot brand UGG. So looking at the story of the BLM Global Network Foundation, it's hard not to assume some significant character flaws of its leaders, but it's also not hard to imagine that all the money and attention from corporate interests did have some effect on their tactics as well. Philosopher Mary Harrington wrote recently in Unheard magazine, quote, "People in glass houses are famously advised not to throw stones, and as the progressive worldview has become more monolithically elite in class terms, it's also lost its antagonism to big business." This is just an observation, my observation, but I think the in-the-streets activist leaders of the 1960s civil rights movement look very different from the champagne-sipping activist leaders of the modern BLM era civil rights movement, right? Just something I read recently. Justin Hansford, a Howard University professor, joked that having an organization called the Black Lives Matter Global Foundation would be akin to having a group in the 1960s call themselves Civil Rights Inc. Essentially, everything today has been corporatized. The activist movements used to be so much more skeptical of the nonprofit sector because of its obvious ties to money and power, but that distrust has seemed to all but disappear. Quote, another example is Planned Parenthood's Action Fund, which reinforces and perpetuates the idea that the solution to large-scale political problems is donating to an organization that then hires a lobbyist, as opposed to, say, building a mass movement capable of occupying Congress or otherwise disrupting business as usual until its demands are met. We seem to have adopted a kind of leave it up to experts mentality. There's a nonprofit today for basically every cause, BLM, Planned Parenthood, or the many Ukraine relief funds that have recently popped up. And for the most part, we just kind of assume that they all know what they're doing and have the best interests of those they claim to serve in mind. So for most socially conscious folks who want to feel like they are contributing positively to society, but are also busy living their own lives, the logical conclusion is to just give money to a nonprofit and let them handle it. But the question is, can the interests of the nonprofit industrial complex, with its ties to mega foundations funded by corporations and the ultra wealthy, actually align to the interests of the people who they claim to serve? Because one has to wonder, are these wealthy, powerful people setting up these foundations for purely altruistic or humanitarian reasons, or do these foundations serve ulterior purposes such as protecting the reputations and projecting the power of the people who run them? And perhaps no other foundation raises this question more than that of the world's largest charitable foundation in the world, the Gates Foundation.
The world is on the brink of a great scientific achievement. A COVID-19 vaccine will likely be ready by early next year. In fact, we'll probably have more than one vaccine ready. These vaccines will allow us to save millions of lives. They'll also have another enormous benefit. They'll allow us to develop a plan for the world to globally eliminate COVID-19.
That was Bill Gates from September of 2020 speaking at an event hosted by the WHO called Accelerating the End of the COVID-19 Pandemic. But my question, and the question we should all be asking, is how did Bill Gates, how did a billionaire in Seattle gain so much power over global public health? In an article titled With the Exact Same Question, Slate reporter Mary Harris interviewed journalist Tim Schwab, who explains, all in all, the Gates Foundation spent $1.8 billion on global public health in 2020 alone. but that meant there were few checks or balances on what Gates-funded groups were up to. If you look across global health, they're funding everybody. Nobody is more than 1 degree removed from the Gates Foundation. So it's really difficult to avoid the foundation's money. And that's also the case for journalists. If you're a journalist writing about global health, you might end up getting a fellowship or a grant to do reporting that's funded by the Gates Foundation. So it's really hard to overstate how much influence that gives the foundation. I think the Gates Foundation has undoubtedly fundamentally altered the image of Bill Gates, right? In the past, viewed as a kind of a monopolistic robber baron when he began building his riches at Microsoft, Gates is now seen today as this magnanimous humanitarian by a lot of folks because he has bought that image through massive investments funneled through his foundation. But I think to no one's surprise, consistently, the Gates Foundation has advocated for this kind of top-down, arguably neo-colonial interventionist policies where the so-called experts from the developed world go into the developing world to once again, quote unquote, solve their problems. Schwab continues, quote, "The Gates Foundation is a very top-down technocratic enterprise where Bill Gates sees himself as this really smart guy with these innovative ideas and technology, and he surrounds himself with this elite cadre of highly educated experts. And it's his view that from this person, Seattle, they can devise solutions to fix all the problems of the global poor. And that's a very different approach than going out into a poor nation or a poor community and talking to people and asking them what they need and what they want." I've talked about the power of capital in my previous Breaking Point segment, and I think it's very applicable here. This idea that in modern America, capital and the interests of capital have risen above the American nation, and political authority is unable to check the power of capital, right? Through the Gates Foundation, Bill Gates has successfully inserted himself at the top of this kind of complex philanthropic empire that allows him to have a major impact on policymaking regarding numerous pressing global issues, all while getting significant tax breaks from the US government. You know, Bill Gates is one of the richest people in the world. The idea that he's giving away all of his money is just not true. In fact, he's getting richer and richer every year. So should this really be considered charity? I think my point is that there should be more scrutiny of the nonprofit sector from all angles. The government needs to do more to ensure effective oversight and enforcement. The media should do more to dedicate more resources into investigating the nonprofit sector beyond just the whims of dredging up fodder for political theater or for partisan interests. And I think we can do more to follow the money when it comes to the nonprofit sector. Who is leading these groups? What might be their ulterior motives? How is my donation money being spent? But perhaps more important, it may behoove us to examine and think about why activism in America today is mostly mediated through the nonprofit industrial complex, and how the proliferation of nonprofits and activism has likely shifted and conflated America's values and beliefs when it comes to what we imagine good activism to be. That is all from me this time. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion about the dark side of the nonprofit industrial complex. If you'd like to know more about this topic and many others, please check out my channel 5149 with James Lee on YouTube, where I release weekly videos about topics relating to the intersection of business, politics, and society. The link will be in the description below. And of course, subscribe to Breaking Points. And thank you so much for your time today.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.